Hello and good morning everyone in Europe, and good evening everyone else, and good night in the US. Hello guys.
Yeah, hello. Good morning to you. Good afternoon.
Hello guys, good to see everyone again. It's been a while since we were streaming. The last one that we did was 2 weeks ago. Simone, can you please give me a sign? It looks like your connection is not agreeing with you once again. You look frozen from here. And there she went. We are now completely dependent on 4G hotspots, and I don't know, it seems like in that room over there, the connection doesn't seem so very good. So maybe she will join here in a little bit, I'm not sure. Hello, Axel, Siep, Philip, Dagmar in Canada. Hello, guys. Cindy, everyone, Petra, Axel, Solama Pagi, Familie van der Maas. They are practicing their Indonesian.
Excellent.
Yeah, and basically they're saying, don't forget, starting next week, daylight savings time will start. So we have to make sure that we start our stream on the proper time. Thank you, Wim. We will do that. Good evening, campers. I agree. Hello, Dick. Hello, Huub. Hey, everyone. Okay, we're still waiting for Simone. She has some issues here with the connection. In the meantime, everyone, I would like to reintroduce a guest that was with us a number of weeks ago. Crissy, welcome back. Thanks a lot for joining us.
It's great to be here.
Great. And yeah, you're a marine biologist. And last time you were with us, you gave a fantastic presentation on octopuses.
Yeah, thank you. And tonight I'll be talking about something different, the deep sea. And it looks like, Simone, you're back.
Hi, you're back.
I'm back. Okay, it's not stable again. I don't know what it is, but the past few weeks around this time, my connection is...
Yeah, it's freezing up. I don't know what it is either. So yeah, anyway, I suggest, Crissy, whenever you're ready. Well, first of all, before we start, I just want to do the usual housekeeping a little bit. All of our guests and friends who have joined us once again, thank you so much for all your kind donations. You saw, some of you have seen your names scrolling by in the ticker during the intro, and we thank you once again. So if you haven't shared the link to our donation page yet, please do. And I also want to ask everyone right now to click the share button next to the stream right here, so that as many people as possible can and hopefully enjoy this session together with Crissy. So Crissy, are you ready?
I am ready. Should I go ahead and start my presentation?
Yep, I'll share it right now.
Okay. Do you see my first slide?
Yep. Yes. Okay. The floor is all yours, Crissy.
Okay, thanks. So thank you for joining me tonight, this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Crissy Huffard. I work at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, and today I'm going to be talking about carbon in the abyss, the good, the bad, and the hungry. And we are carbon-based life forms. Carbon is in all of our cells. It's in the cells of these dolphins. It is the energy that we need, that we burn as we live and grow and reproduce. Animals get carbon by eating other animals. This Humboldt squid in the California current is eating a fish to get its carbon. And this is the case for animals of all different shapes and sizes in the deep sea. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
We've got some comments here. Someone is saying we can't see the slide as the whole slide.
So it looks like, is it that you're seeing black on the sides?
No, it's not on
You're just seeing like a little part?
Yeah.
Okay.
the center
So
mode.
that's a little.
Yeah, it needs to be in presentation mode.
It was in presentation mode. This mode is presentation mode.
Not what I'm seeing.
Okay, so maybe that's because of my screen resolution. So let me try that. I had changed my screen resolution to be more in line with what Facebook video is. But this,
or maybe you can simply full screen it. Would that work?
Yeah. This is back to my normal screen resolution. How does that look? Is that any better?
Not yet. No,
No, not still.
I'm just seeing like a very compressed version of the PowerPoint window.
So this is now my maximum resolution. This is full screen for me. I don't know what else to do on my end, and this is kind of how I did it for the last presentation. So
yeah, that's weird. So last time it looked a lot better, so I suggest just quit out of PowerPoint if you don't mind, and then reshare it.
Sure. So I've turned off PowerPoint, and I'm going to turn it back on.
And Simone, your connection looks a lot better as well.
All right, how does that look?
Yeah,
you do need
I'm
to share
outside
it.
now.
Oh, okay. Sharing screen, just the application window. Do you want me to try? I'm going to do just the application window this time.
Yep. There you go.
Did that work?
Well, now it's vertical. It's really weird.
That is really weird.
Are you in presentation mode again? Because we see, I see like nothing but a series of like a set of slides, like a stack of slides.
That is weird because I am in presentation mode. So what if I try just sharing my whole screen?
Sure.
So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to reshare. Okay, so now I'm going to share my entire screen. And maybe this will be better. How about that?
There you go. That's a lot better. Yep. Perfect.
Okay, good.
All right. Crissy, back to you.
Let's get started. So yeah, carbon in the abyss, in the deep sea, which is a story about carbon in our cells, carbon in the cells of the animals all over the ocean, including this deep sea barrel eye fish. You know, carbon can be in cells that are clear, that are different colors. And this is the case for animals from the surface all the way to the deep sea floor, like this Peniagone species A that is in the abyss. And this story of carbon in the deep sea and in the ocean really starts with phytoplankton. And phytoplankton are single-celled algae that use photosynthesis to get their energy from the sun and combine it with carbon dioxide that has dissolved in the surface waters in order to make sugars and other building blocks of life. And this is the base of most of the ocean food web. Yes, there are chemosynthetic organisms and microbes in the hydrothermal vents, but that's not what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about most of ocean life, which relies on algae and phytoplankton for its energy. And that phytoplankton supplies a lot of the oxygen on Earth. 50 to 80% of oxygen production is thanks to phytoplankton and marine algae. And so we really have the ocean to thank for every other breath that we take. And animals have evolved lots of ways to protect the carbon in their bodies. Defenses, animal defenses, camouflage are ways that animals try to avoid being part of the food web or part of the transfer of carbon from one animal to another. This octopus is camouflaged because it doesn't want to become a meal. It wants to protect the carbon in its body and keep it for itself, keep it in its own body. And additionally, predators have evolved lots of different ways to access carbon or food sources that weren't available to their ancestors. This is a sea otter along the California coast, and it is related to weasels and river otters. And sea otters have evolved really thick fur that allows them to hunt in very cold waters along our coast and access carbon sources that wouldn't have been available to their ancestors. And the story of carbon in the ocean is really a story of change. This is a graph of the last 800,000 years worth of atmospheric carbon dioxide. And we can see that it fluctuated over time, but then really spiked in the last, a little more than 100 years. And that is from the emissions of fossil fuel burning that humans have introduced extra carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. And the release of that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is not uniform in time or space. This is an animation created by NASA that shows atmospheric carbon dioxide on a daily scale. Red colors and warm colors are places where the carbon dioxide levels are higher in the atmosphere. Cool colors like blues and greens are areas where there's less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we can see that it changes pretty quickly over time and space. And this carbon dioxide acts like a blanket in our atmosphere, trapping the heat from the sun and holding it into Earth. And lucky for us, the ocean has taken up over 90% of that extra heat, that extra insulating power that carbon dioxide we have added to the atmosphere through our fossil fuel burning and other activities. That has made the ocean a lot warmer than it used to be. And as things warm, they expand. And the ocean water has expanded, and that as it warms, and that creates thermal expansion, it's called, and that is a major contributor to sea level rise. In addition to ice cap melting, sea level rise is happening all over the world, especially in the tropics. I'm sure you're quite aware of it, those of you in Indonesia. But it's definitely a problem world over. As water gets warmer, it can also hold less oxygen. Liquids as they warm hold less gas. This is, physics. That as the ocean is warming, it is holding less oxygen. There are major areas in the ocean that have much less oxygen and practically no oxygen, and those areas are growing. And finally, the ocean has taken up about 25% of the carbon dioxide that we have added to the atmosphere through our activities, and that has made the ocean more acidic. And these are, the numbers fluctuate with time and as activities change, but for the most part, these processes they're not argued among the scientific community. The ocean is heating, it's becoming less oxygenated, and it's becoming more acidic due to our activities. And this bit on the right here, the take up of carbon dioxide by the ocean, is what I'm going to focus on tonight. And so our big picture questions are, how much, if any, of that carbon actually makes its way to the deep sea? If we think about where carbon goes in the ocean, it can go lots of different places, or it can get released right back into the atmosphere. And does any of it, and how much, make its way to the deep sea, where it's very far from the atmosphere and is unlikely to reach the atmosphere again anytime soon. What happens to it once it's down there? This is an important building block of life, and does it impact life once carbon reaches the deep sea? And I studied these questions with a team of folks at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, MBARI, in Moss Landing, California. And we're at the head of a deep sea canyon in the Monterey Bay. And this allows us pretty easy access to deep ecosystems. And MBARI is a collaboration between engineers and scientists, biologists, ecologists, chemists, and ship's crew, communicators, ROV pilots, people with lots of different backgrounds trying to engineer new ways to understand the major questions related to the ocean. And we studied the deep sea because it's a major habitat on Earth. More than 70% of the planet is covered by the ocean, and abyssal plains, abyssal habitats, make up over 70% of that. We study an abyssal site called Station M off the Central California coast that's 4 kilometers deep, and Station M has been studied for over 30 years to understand how much carbon makes its way there and what happens to it once it gets there. When the Station M time series was started, back in the late 80s, people were just starting to really test some of the major hypotheses, scientific questions related to the deep sea. At that time, it was a new idea that the deep sea even changed at all. About 50 years ago, it was a pretty prominent hypothesis that, or assumption, that the deep sea was always stable and never changed. And the Station M time series, along with just there are only a couple of other time series in the deep sea that are this long running, have really shown that that's not the case. The deep sea is very dynamic. Sometimes we can see changes at Station M just a few days after changes in the surface, maybe days to weeks later, changes in the surface can be seen at Station M 4,000 meters deep. Changes at Station M can also relate to changes in the surface ocean, in the weather above the water, in the atmosphere, and in the climate. So the deep sea really is connected to the rest of the Earth, the rest of the water column, and our weather and climate. And those connections, in a way, start with phytoplankton, as I said, and act through a process called the biological carbon pump. And this is, single-celled algae in the waters. Phytoplankton sink through the water column. They're eaten by zooplankton, which poop out little poops, little fecal pellets. As those materials and dead animal parts and fish scales, things like that, sink through the water column, they create marine snow. Marine snow sinks. It gets consumed by lots of different microbes and animals as it sinks. Eventually, some of it might land on the seafloor. And animals there on the seafloor are waiting to use that as their food, their main carbon source. Some of that doesn't get eaten and might be incorporated into sediments that can be stored away from the atmosphere on geologic timescales. So this process is sort of the core of how carbon makes its way to the deep ocean and might get sequestered in some quantity in deep sea sediments. And what this looks like, this is footage taken by a remotely operated vehicle as it's going down through the water column. We can see marine snow. It looks like it's going up, but it's not. The marine snow is sinking, just not as fast as the ROV is descending. And we can see that marine snow can look very different. It's not a uniform thing. The marine snow on the left is big and chunky. The marine snow on the right is very small. It might be made of smaller phytoplankton or phytoplankton that don't stick together very easily. And these views are somewhat representative of the types of phytoplankton that we might see on the left would be an example of coastal phytoplankton that has a lot of nutrient input. There's a lot of energy and carbon in the system. On the right would be an example of marine snow that we might see in the open ocean, which would be a lower energy system, not as much food available, not as much marine snow. And as the seawater is warming in the open ocean is warming, pretty fast. It's taking up a lot of that heat. Excuse me. That's slowing down the processes that allow phytoplankton to grow and sink as marine snow. It's limiting nutrient upwelling, and it's increasing the recycling of those nutrients in the surface waters. On the other hand, excuse me,
Hello, Crissy, can you hear me?
yes, can you hear me?
I can again. We just got kicked out of our hotspots earlier, so I apologize.
Okay. It's good to know. Glad to know that you can hear me. Do you need me to back up at all?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I think so, because we got some comments that the viewers lost some sound. So maybe if you could just back up for a minute.
Okay. This might have been okay. Let's try here. So, we study the process called the biological carbon pump, which starts as single-celled phytoplankton and other algae grow in surface waters. They're eaten by zooplankton, which poop out the carbon that was once in phytoplankton and once in the atmosphere down into little poops. Those phytoplankton, as they die, they sink. Those poops sink. They can stick together as marine snow. All of that, as it sinks through the water column, is great food. It's got lots of rich carbon and nutrients in it. It's eaten by microbes and organisms as it sinks and lands on the seafloor. Some of that may get eaten. Most of that actually gets eaten by animals on the seafloor that are waiting for it as food. But some of it is actually left over and can be stored in sediments for geologic time. So this is marine snow. This is what this looks like. It's a remotely operated vehicle footage going down through the water column. The marine snow looks like it's going up, but it's actually sinking, just not as fast as the ROV is descending. And we have big chunky marine snow from coastal areas on the left, kind of small amounts of marine snow, which is smaller, that is more representative of open ocean areas on the right. As the seawater on the surface is warming, especially in open ocean areas, we're seeing less production and sinking of marine snow in open ocean areas. As the land heats up in certain parts of the world, like on the US West Coast, for example, the land heats up faster than the ocean, and that's driving stronger seasonal winds that drive stronger seasonal upwelling. That's bringing more nutrients to the surface in those coastal areas and creating more marine snow production. And so this just shows you that marine snow is dynamic. It changes. The amount of carbon taken up by the ocean by phytoplankton changes over time and is also different in different regions. Here we have an ROV that's descending from the surface waters where there's lots of marine snow and zooplankton. We can see these pyrosomes. They're gelatinous organisms that live in the surface waters. As we go deeper, there's less and less marine snow. Here we can see at 3,000 meters, there's not much at all because a lot of it's been eaten by the time it gets here. As we get close to the sea floor, there's a little bit of muddiness because of, suspension of those bottom muds, just like when we go muck diving. And on the sea floor, we see that there are certain things that make it all the way down to the sea floor. Here's a pyrosome, like I showed you in surface waters. It looks very different on the seafloor compared to what pyrosomes look like in the surface because they've largely been transformed as they sink through the water column. A lot of their nutrients and carbon have been eaten by microbes and maybe small scavengers in the water column as it sinks. And so what makes its way to the deep sea floor is just a fraction of what's produced in surface waters. And that's because the entire ocean midwater, which is the largest habitable volume on Earth, is full of, mouths and tentacles, things that want to eat other things. And those animals that are deeper than the sunlit waters rely on food sinking from above, such as marine snow or other animals that swim around them. And that's true for the mollusks, for the fishes, for the cnidarians, all of these animals. Once you get below the sunlit surface waters where photosynthesis occurs, they're largely relying on food sinking down as carbon. And those life forms have many forms, and they look pretty different from the forms that we're used to seeing in aquatic systems, and especially, but also in shallow water marine systems. We think of predators in the shallow waters, we think of sharks and tuna, and this is a siphonophore. And this is a major predator in the ocean. And this siphonophore eats zooplankton and other animals, and it's a major consumer and predator that certainly wouldn't want to run into, and it traps a lot of carbon that might be sinking on its way to the deep sea. This is a larvation. It's kind of a favorite among carbon scientists studying deep sea carbon and midwater carbon. It's actually, even though it looks like this tiny little tadpole with this thing underneath it, it's actually one of our closer underwater relatives. It has a notochord, or underwater, invertebrate relatives. It has a notochord, but it's like this little tiny tadpole thing beating its tail, and underneath it is a mucus house. So this thing doesn't have any hands, and yet it creates this incredible mucus structure with chambers in it that filters and directs flow and brings particles like food into its body, into its gut efficiently. And when these mucus houses get full and clogged, the larvation swims away, creates another one. The old one collapses and sinks to the seafloor, bringing lots of carbon with it. And in that way, larvations, which are these tiny zooplankton, are really important for transporting carbon and food from the surface ocean and other depths to depths deeper, to the deep ocean. And remember, that food, that carbon, contains carbon that was once in the atmosphere in the surface waters.
All right, sorry to interrupt, Crissy.
Yeah.
Awesome. I just want to say to everyone who's watching, please feel free to ask any questions to Crissy. That's what she's here for. She took a strong cup of coffee and she had a nap before she started. But yeah, so everyone, if you do have any questions, just line them up in the comments, and then Crissy will be happy to answer. And that's about it from me. Please do continue.
Okay. Okay, so what does it actually look like to study carbon in the deep sea? And how do we actually do that? So this carbon is in marine snow. It's sinking down, and we put what are called sediment traps. We have 2 sediment traps here on the deck of the ship on a mooring that the sediment traps kind of hang in the water column above the seafloor. And they have a big funnel, and underneath is a little carousel of bottles, and that carousel rotates. We program it to rotate every 10 days, but you can set it to different dates. The carousel of bottles rotates every 10 days. A new bottle sits under the funnel, and then that just keeps going. And we come back after a year, bring it up to the surface, bring it up onto the ship, take the bottles back to the lab, and measure how much carbon is in them. We also want to understand more than just marine snow. We want to understand the impact on animal communities as well. And in order to do that, we need to understand the diversity and behaviors of animals, but we have to do that on scales that are appropriate for them. This is a deep sea worm called an enterapneust, an acorn worm, and it's not a worm the way we think of it, but it has the common name, an acorn worm. And it moves so slowly that you might not have noticed when the video showing this animal moving changed to a still image, just the last frame of that video, because it moves so slowly. And so we need a way of observing these animals over longer timescales that show their movements and kind of translate those movements to timescales we're used to thinking of. And so in order to do that, we have a time-lapse camera on a large tripod frame. So tripod, just the way you're used to using tripods with underwater photography and land photography. This is the same concept. It's just deeper and bigger. And on the top of this frame, we see these canisters. That's the camera. The big yellow things on the side, those are the strobes. And this time-lapse camera system, the camera's about 2 meters off the seafloor, and it takes a picture every hour and has been doing so more or less since 1989. We bring it up to download images and to change the batteries and to fix anything that needs to be fixed. But for the most part, we have a time series dating back to 1989 showing changes on the seafloor every hour.
Wow, fantastic.
Yeah.
I have one question here from
Sure.
Graham, and he's asking, he's got a question on ocean acidity. Is there a
Yes.
correlation between a rise in seawater acidity and periods of greater volcanic or tectonic activity that has been observed?
I don't know exactly, and I'll get into that a little bit later. I mean, ocean acidification is definitely an issue with as carbon is taken up into the ocean. As ash is taken up into the ocean, it's not quite as bioavailable in the same way. It doesn't go through the same processes that lead to that CO2 dissolving directly into the ocean, and it's not eaten as readily as other forms of organic carbon and other forms of carbon. And so, an animal's less likely to eat it and then respire that CO2 back into the water. I don't study volcanic ash specifically, but that's my understanding of what happens based on other types of ash. So
Right.
good question.
Yeah, and I think kind of related to that, Dick van Straten is asking what's the effect of acidification on the deep sea system and vice versa, but I guess you already kind of answered that.
Well, yeah, and I'll get into that a little bit toward the end.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question, Crissy?
Yeah.
Since you are making photos every hour?
Every hour. Yeah.
Yes, that is impressive. Since 1989, even.
Mm-hmm.
It has nothing to do with your carbon, but is there any? Do you have any photos of increasing garbage like plastics
I'll get to that too.
on the? Oh, fantastic! Thank you.
Yeah, but shortly, just briefly now, while it's on your mind, we don't see much plastic on the seafloor at Station M. We do see it now and then, but we haven't analyzed our time series in that way. I'm guessing that if we were to look at our data specifically for Station M for this site, we would not see an increase because it's so rare for our time-lapse cameras and our other types of surveys to see plastic. I think the sample size would be very low. But I'll get into other angles of that later.
Thank you.
Sure. And so what the time-lapse camera can show us is animals sort of on the timescales that are relevant to them. This is that same type of animal, the Enterobnust, and we can see it feeds by doing this spiral movement and then a switchback movement, and then it swims off. And Enterobnusts are animals that leave these distinct trails that are very abundant in the fossil record. And people are trying to study the fossils to try to understand if there's a relationship between the way that Enterobnust feeds and environmental conditions. And I wish I were in an auditorium now or in person so that I could ask you to raise your hand if you've ever heard of a Mars rover or a Moon rover, especially recently. I'm sure we all have. But how many have heard of the Benthic rover? Probably not many of you. You would have seen it on the image link for this presentation, but we have one fully autonomous rover in the deep sea, even though this is our planet, and we have one. And the Benthic rover at this point has traveled a total of over 12 kilometers since 2011 at Station M. And it takes lots of different measurements for us. It operates, a year at a time. We drop it off over the side of the boat. It sinks down to the sea floor, 4,000 kilometers or 4,000 meters deep. It transits the sea floor very lightly. It only weighs about a little over 100 pounds in water, even though it's the size of a sport utility vehicle. Takes measurements, transits the sea floor. A year later, we bring it up and download the data, change the batteries, service what needs to be serviced. The Benthic rover is quite complicated technology, so this is not something that I do. Engineers on our team come to sea with us. They designed the Benthic rover and created it, and they maintain it and operate it. This is the Benthic rover on the sea floor. This video is sped up many, many times because the Benthic rover operates very slowly. I don't know, it's the water temperature at Station M is about 1.4, 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's about 34 degrees Fahrenheit. It's very cold. And if you've ever tried to operate your cell phone in the cold, you know that batteries don't work very well when they're very cold. And so one way that the engineers have maximized the battery life of the rover is to make it move very slowly. The video that we saw showed the Benthic rover turning into the current and then lowering something into the sediment. That is called a respirometry chamber. It measures respiration, or the uptake of oxygen by there's some oxygen sensors in that little acrylic chamber that gets lowered into the sediment, and over the course of 2 days it measures how much oxygen is drawn down, so how much the oxygen levels decrease in the water that is enclosed in that chamber. From that, we can calculate how much metabolism has gone on, how much carbon consumption has gone on, and from that we estimate seafloor community carbon demand, and that's microbes, that's animals that live in the sediment or that might be sitting on top of the sediment. Peniagone species A is an important one of those animals. Here we can see it actually eating a glob of detritus on the seafloor. So this is a big chunk of marine snow that's landed on the seafloor. It might be a larvation house. It probably has a lot of phytoplankton in it. We can see it's still kind of greenish. Some phytoplankton sink very quick, and other forms of marine snow can sink very quickly to the deep sea. Sometimes from the surface to 4,000 meters deep in just a matter of days. And so it can be quite fresh by the time it gets there. And that's important for animals like Peniagone species A, because even though this animal lives 4,000 meters deep, really far away from the sunlight, it will never live in sunlit waters. It can't make its way to the surface. it relies, and some of its relatives appear to rely on nutrients that are found in fresh chlorophyll or fresh phytoplankton like chlorophyll and other nutrients, other pigments that are found in there for their reproduction. So imagine an animal that will never get to the habitat where the food that it relies on for reproduction is from. It needs all of that food to be delivered to it in fresh condition, which is pretty amazing to think of. And so from the Station M time series, we bring the cups back, the sediment trap cups, and for the first, 20 years or so, things were pretty quiet. The 90s until the early 2000s. Over 10 days, we might only collect a few tablespoons worth of sediment in marine snow. Not much was coming down. And this is what that looks like from the time-lapse camera. We can see this sea cucumber, this thing crawling around. That's Psychropodes. Its common name is something like the gummy squirrel sea cucumber, something like that. We can also see in the front some zoanthids. And these animals, as you can see, there's not a whole lot going on. It's pretty sparse. There's not a lot of carbon or energy driving this system.
I think gummy squirrel is now my favorite word.
Yeah, it's pretty great. They're very squishy. Very, very delicate and gelatinous. But then about 10 years or so, things really started to change in a big way. We brought up the sediment trap, and the cups had lots and lots of material in it. Literally years worth of marine snow was coming down in a matter of weeks to months. And we often saw little spikes earlier in the time series, but these spikes are getting bigger, they're lasting longer, they're bringing more and more carbon, more and more food down to the system in the deep sea. And this is what that looks like. This is an example of time-lapse imagery from 2012. We can see kind of the pinkish-orange Peniagone species A crawling around, and we can see that the seafloor, we can see kind of greenish globs that land on it, and eventually so much of those globs cover the seafloor that the whole seafloor looks brownish green. And then all of the animals and microbes on the seafloor eat it, and it becomes sort of a beige color again. And this is an event where a lot of marine snow that is pretty fresh still in it still has a lot of its surface carbon and nutrients, has landed on the seafloor in a very short amount of time and has become a really important food source to this community that now it's a lot more active. There's a lot more biomass down there now because there's a lot more carbon down there to fuel it. We can also see up in the upper left here, under the 23rd of August, this animal that's sort of spinning around. Just a fun fact, there are tides at Station M. It swings back and forth because the water is sloshing back and forth with the tides. So 4,000 meters deep, there's still a tide that's pretty similar to the tides that we see on the surface in California. And one of the big winners of all this extra food is Peniagone species A. It's been very efficient at turning that food into new biomass, into new Peniagone species A. It's taken carbon that was in the surface, maybe, and potentially in the atmosphere, maybe even weeks to months earlier, and turned it into more deep sea cucumbers. Peniagone species A can also swim. This is video shot by the Doc Ricketts, the remotely operated vehicle Doc Ricketts. And as we zoom in, we can see that its head is kind of orangish. Its body is transparent, but we can see its eggs inside. And Peniagone species A has separate males and females. This female will eventually spawn her eggs through her head. Males spawn the sperm through their head. And the larvae are fertilized in the water column. The eggs are fertilized in the water column to form embryos that grow into zygotes and larvae. And most animals in the sea, in the ocean, not just the deep sea, but most animals in the ocean have some sort of fertilization, sexual reproduction, and many of those use external fertilization for reproduction. So the eggs and sperm are released into the water column and come together in the water. And where this ties back into the question about ocean acidification is that this process, these life forms are very susceptible to changes in water quality and water conditions. And as the water is becoming more acidic, it's very hard on eggs and sperm and fertilization processes in the water column. And so those are important for the reproduction of most life forms in the deep sea. So this is a really important thing, that the changes in the uptake of carbon that lead to ocean acidification are impacting reproduction. Another aspect of this is that as that carbon gets eaten by these animals, they take in the carbon, bring it into their bodies. They also take in oxygen as they do that and exhale carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide that they exhale contributes to acidification. As they take up that oxygen, they take up more and more and more because there's more carbon to take up, right? So they take that all up, and that can lower the oxygen levels in the ocean. And we actually have seen a small decline, but still a long-term decline in the oxygen levels at Station M. And the examples that I've given so far of food reaching the deep sea have largely been from phytoplankton, but they occur in other ways as well. We hear about whale falls sometimes, as whales and other large animals in the surface waters die. Many of them float and are eaten by other animals on the surface, but some of them sink. We've never seen a whale fall at Station M, but we have seen other animals land on the seafloor. This is from 2012, when a large swarm of salps died in the surface waters and then sank en masse and landed on the seafloor. And they became a really important food source for the animals down there, as did their fecal pellets, their poops that kind of look like little wheat bix, but just like, I don't know, a centimeter or two long at most. And they're a really important way that carbon makes its way to the seafloor. And this is something that made the news in California and along the US West Coast. These salps, this is what they look like in the surface water, with a diver in the back or a snorkeler in the background. On the surface, they form these big chains, and so many of them swarmed in the surface waters that they clogged fishing nets, they clogged intakes of power plants. They were extremely abundant, and they were considered a nuisance. But what people didn't necessarily also report, that they were also creating an enormous ecosystem service for us, because they were taking carbon. They're very efficient grazers of phytoplankton. So they ate tons of phytoplankton, incorporated that into forms that sink very quickly to the ocean. So they took carbon that was recently in the atmosphere, then incorporated into phytoplankton and transported it deep into the deep sea, where it's not likely to reach the atmosphere again anytime soon. And that process is what helps the ocean take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so people ask, is it good or bad? And I just say yes, because it's both. This process is really good because as the ocean takes up all that carbon dioxide, it keeps the Earth habitable for us humans. But all of these processes have impacts. I've mentioned that it leads to ocean acidification and deoxygenation. It also leads to changes in other animals as well that might not be able to handle these changes in carbon. So in the middle of the frame here, this is really sped up time-lapse imagery from Station M. We see this white cup that's kind of squeezing on a stalk. That's a sponge. And so most sponges we think of as not having behavior, But research from colleagues at Station M have shown that sponges actually do contract. And it looks like when we see it in this image, these time-lapse images, that sponges are contracting as they sort of look like they might have some marine snow or other gunk on it. Then when they expand again, they appear to be cleared of that gunk. And, is this some sort of underwater very slow motion sneeze or cough? We think that might be the case. And so it might be that sponges are being overwhelmed by all of this carbon. And from our data at Station M, it seems like the sponges might be able to handle a large range of marine snow coming down, but many sponges seem to have died after the Salp fall event in 2012. And so all of these processes are perfectly natural. They happen over time, but the rate at which they're happening and the magnitude at which they're happening appears to be changing. And it's impacting lots of different animals in lots of different ways. There's no clear good or bad. Other ways that carbon enters into the ocean. This is a satellite image of the West Coast, Northern California, Oregon, Washington, some Nevada, Idaho there. And these orange spots are wildfires that we had over the summer. And we can see smoke blowing west from these wildfires. During these wildfire events, we had major wind events and smoke blew way out to sea. I mean, where you are globally, you might have experienced some of this smoke. It was certainly really hazardous for those of us here in California. And a lot of that smoke actually can settle on to the water, as it did. These are rack lines on the beach, one of the beaches locally here in the Monterey Bay. And you can see that they're black, where the water has washed up and left some of that charred material, that ash, on the beaches. Those of us who spend time in the water for the weeks until, well after the wildfire events, there was charred material floating in the surface water. It was like a soup of charcoal and ash in the surface waters in the Monterey Bay following these wildfire events very quickly after the wildfires started. And then a few weeks later, we had the opportunity to use a remotely operated vehicle just outside of the Monterey Bay, and we actually could see, I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but I'm circling a black thing kind of in the middle of the screen on the right-hand side of the frame. Those are charred redwood needles. The coast redwoods are the very, very large trees we have here in the Santa Cruz Mountains and other areas along the California coastal and inland California. They get enormous. They can live thousands of years old. And we found that carbon that was once in those trees in the Santa Cruz Mountains got burned, and within weeks was on the deep sea floor 700 meters, and potentially might get incorporated into deep sea sediments and sequester that carbon long term. And so taking it a step back, we have a lot of different complex processes in how the ocean has dealt with this extra carbon dioxide that we've put into the atmosphere. It's taken up the heat, it's lowered the oxygen, and it's become more acidic. But in general, one of the ways that the ocean reduces these impacts on us is to take up carbon dioxide and transfer it to the deep ocean, where it can be stored on geologic time scales. And the least impactful way that happens, as far as we can tell, is when that carbon makes its way into the deep sea sediments and can be stored for many, many tens of thousands of years or longer, at millennial scales, geologic time scales. One thing that can undo that process, that takes a really long time and is very slow and arduous from an ecological standpoint, is deep sea mining. And this is a process that is in the exploration stages now. It's not happening at commercial scales at this point, but many companies are exploring the possibilities of doing this. There are areas in the ocean that have rare earth minerals, cobalt, gold, other minerals, in what are called manganese nodules, which are little crusts that form on the deep sea floor, little metal crusts, and they occur in certain open ocean areas on the deep sea floor, and they occur in areas where very little marine snow is produced and sunk into the seafloor. So any carbon that's in that that sediment has taken many thousands of years to get stored up because that seafloor system is so food limited. As mining test operations and proposals are slated to occur, and the designs show that that mining process will stir up a lot of that sediment, taking carbon that was stored in it and bringing it back into contact with consumers, with microbes that will eat it and potentially respire it back into the water, causing deoxygenation and acidification. So this is a system that we actually don't know a lot about because it hasn't been done, but everything that we know about deep sea systems makes us think that these activities, if they occur, will have lots of negative consequences for the ecosystems in the deep sea and other midwater ecosystems, like, you know, throughout a tuna's range, for example. Another way that carbon can make its way into the ocean in a harmful way is through plastics. And the first scientific report in the English literature on plastics in the sea was written based on observations from the Sargasso Sea by Ed Carpenter, who's up in San Francisco, and Ken Smith, who is my collaborator here at MBARI. Ken also started the Station M time series. And this was in 1972. So it's, from an ecological standpoint and an evolutionary standpoint, it's very recent. From a scientific standpoint, it's a really long time ago. And so little was done for so long to understand the impacts of plastics in the deep sea, or in the ocean, let alone the deep sea. But that's as plastics have become more prevalent and noticeable, you know, the past 10 years, 10, 15 years, people have studied it more. And plastics we think of as floating in the ocean. That's what we're used to seeing when we go diving or snorkeling. But plastics can also sink in their larger form. And physical transport mechanisms like, you know, just settling processes and currents often concentrate deep sea waste like plastics into canyons. So we see a lot in certain areas of the Monterey Canyon. We don't see much at Station M. There's not a lot of activity above Station M in terms of human activity. It doesn't concentrate in that area, but there's probably a lot of plastics on the seafloor below the deep sea gyres, and we see lots in deep sea canyons. Yes?
No, I just wanted to say it's a shame. I've got one question from Graham.
Sure.
He wants to know, based on what we know, or you know, currently, what is the increase in seawater temperature and acidification to date? And what is the prediction based on current trends for, say, 2030?
Those are not numbers that I have handy. I'd have to look them up, but I'd be happy to look them up and email them to you.
Okay, great.
Sure.
Yeah, no, that's what I have in terms of questions so far.
Okay, sounds good. So when we think about plastics in the ocean, we tend to think about, or at least until very recently, think about large things like, you know, a cup or a toothbrush or a flip-flop. And people often wondered how so much plastic made its way to the seafloor, because we think of plastic as buoyant, but it turns out that biological mechanisms also take part. Microplastics, it turns out, are more abundant in the deep sea than on the surface. And So that is very concerning. It basically tells us that what we're seeing on the surface is just a tiny fraction of what is actually in the ocean. 8 million tons of plastics get put into the ocean every year. And it's not like there's something that takes it out at a scale that's ecologically meaningful. So there is a lot of plastic in the ocean, including microplastics, tiny pieces of plastics that are small enough to be taken up as food by zooplankton, including the larvation. So the larvation here is actually capable of taking up microplastic, filtering it from the water column, and then incorporating those microplastics into its little poops, and those sink down the water column to the deep sea. So even though the microplastics themselves might have originally been buoyant, as they get stirred up and incorporated into other biological products, they can sink to the deep sea floor. And so that's a lot of heavy stuff here. Like, there's a lot going on with the deep sea, with the surface ocean. A lot of it relates back to our actions. And the ocean has undergone a lot of change. But one thing that we also know is that the healthier marine ecosystems are, the better the water quality, the more complete the animal communities, with grazers to predators to, all sorts of, mollusks and fishes and marine mammals, things like that. The more complete and healthy the ecosystems are, the better they'll be able to handle these changes, because they are happening. And they're not something that we can just easily engineer our way out of. All of the engineering, things like carbon, iron fertilization and deep sea carbon sequestration methods have some sort of impacts, and at this point are yet to prove that carbon that is sinking down from the surface waters through fertilization actually is incorporated into the sediments. That would need to be shown in order to be effective and not super harmful in itself. So thank you very much for your attention across many time zones. Thanks to my collaborators at MBARI. This research was funded by the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, and we couldn't do our work without the crews of the ROV Doc Ricketts, the pilots of the Doc Ricketts, and the crew of the Western Flyer. I showed animations by Eric Knight Maps and Frame 48. If you're interested in the deep sea and want to see more videos of deep sea animals and understand more about deep sea ecology and technology, please follow MBARI News. We have a Twitter account, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. We've got lots of outreach out there. So thank you very much.
Wow. Well, thank you, Crissy.
Wow, Crissy, that was fantastic.
Okay,
thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank
Should I
you
stop
so much.
sharing? Should I get out of presentation mode here?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Be good to see you again.
Good to see you again. Well, that was a lot of information and a lot of stuff that I didn't know.
Yeah. Amazing, amazing. It's really, I had a million questions, but you were all in the mood. So, can I ask you just one?
Of course.
I forgot the scientific name. So the small tadpole with the tail, right?
Yeah, the larvation.
Yes, you said it had it is like one of our forebears, like it has a spinal.
It has a notochord, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it in a way related to the Ascidians as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's related to tunicates.
Because that was a presentation from Stephen Weinberg, and he was explaining that the tunicates are actually also one of, well, very, very old, let's say,
Yes.
our forebears.
Yes, they're very closely related.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll have
It
to
even
watch
looks a
that
little
one.
bit like it. It even looks a little bit like it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy to think that tunicates are so incredibly important to the global carbon cycle and the relatives.
Yeah,
pretty unassuming little animals.
I'm very, very enthusiastic about tourniquets. I think they're very fascinating.
Yeah,
they're
beautiful.
Yes, they are. And one other question. I am really not into it, but I heard that they recently found a bacteria that actually consumes plastics. Do you know anything about that? Is that also a deep sea bacteria that does that?
I've seen the headlines, but I don't know for sure. I don't know that. But yeah, I have seen the headlines that there are bacteria that eat plastics, but I don't know about the biology or where they live.
Okay. And the carbon that stays on the bottom, is that eventually turning into oil or diamonds? Because diamonds are also made of carbon, and we have a very high pressure there. So are there diamonds on the bottom, on the sea bottom?
I don't know. I don't know anything about the geologic processes that produce diamonds. I mean, sure, I'm going to look into that. I don't know. But we don't have
carbon under pressure.
We've never found it. Sure is. We've never found any. But deep sea oil, definitely. And there are lots of oil deposits, and because that process of the carbon getting incorporated into the sediments is such a slow process, it takes a really long time for that oil to be produced.
Yeah, well, I'm going even one step further, and I can understand if you don't know the answer for that. Mm-hmm. A lot of plastics are produced out of oil.
Yes.
If you submerge a plastic bag in benzene, it completely dissolves. Mm-hmm. It turns into some slurry something. If all these plastic bags that are on the sea floor are eventually turn into oil, could they dissolve because of the carbon concentration?
Yeah, that's a really great question. We really have no idea what the very, very long-term fate of those plastics will be. I think that's a reasonable thing to think that they could be buried and incorporated in the sediments in regions where oil is produced, many, many thousands of years from now as they get buried. Whether they actually become part of that oil, I don't know. I mean, I imagine that depends on how microbes might or might not be able to break them down.
Yeah. Well, it might be
That's
the rescue of the world. It might be the savings of the world.
Yeah,
but then,
we're going to have to wait a while.
We have to get rid of the people first, right?
Yeah, I think we're doing that ourselves.
Well, related to that, we have Wim, one of our Dutch viewers, who says if people go extinct, we will exist once again.
Yeah, our footprint is going to be here a long time.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm getting a link here from Dennis about this plastic-eating super enzyme that recycles plastic bottles.
Great.
Might want to take a look at that. If you're interested, maybe take a look in the comments there.
Okay.
And
I've got Graham always with the knowledge.
Oh, we don't have the heat.
No, we don't. Yeah. We have the pressure though.
Yeah.
No, not that much.
Well, not that much. Not that much.
No, not that much.
Yeah.
Okay, so no diamonds. Yeah, I'm very disappointed, Graham.
Yep.
And
maybe real deep.
Yeah. On a less mature note, there were 3 terms that I learned during this presentation. Thank you for that. That was whale fall. I had never heard of that before, so that's very interesting. Gummy squirrel, obviously, that's now my favorite. And marine snow was completely new for me. So yeah, you definitely brought us some fantastic new insights here. So once again, thanks a lot, Crissy.
Yeah,
I'm not sure what I'm not sure what it will do on word feud, by the way.
Word feud.
Yeah. But yeah, just something to think of when on days when you have good visibility and bad visibility. A lot of that is, some of that is just sediment and some is marine snow.
Right. Yep. And Graham's going to bring you diamonds, Simone.
Well, they're a girl's best friends, Graham. You know that.
Wow. So finally our connection is cooperating with us, and
when we're finished, right?
When we're finished. So we but anyway, that's how it works here. We're on jungle fiber, so we have to cut our losses. Once again, Crissy, thank you very much. I want to thank everyone who is watching, and we will see you next time, I guess. Simone, do you want to add anything before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I didn't even say hello, guys, because of the bad connection. So hello and goodbye. Hello. So have a nice weekend, everybody. Just a reminder that we have decided to stop with the Zoom parties, but that we will continue as much as we can with the streams. We will try to. We have some ideas about the future stream, so stay posted. Next week we have summertime, so we start an hour earlier. And other than that, what is new? Monday, all the Thalassa staff gets vaccinated. We hope. Wow. Because we were on the schedule last week, and then it was postponed until Thursday, and then it was postponed until tomorrow. So all staff, 46 of them, will get vaccinated. And so we're very happy with that. And then for the ones that didn't catch that last week, Bali has announced that they will open they will open the island for tourism in June, July. So that is a good sign as well. And since North Sulawesi is a little bit envious with Bali, they will probably follow soon too. 3,600 people working in tourism industry are being vaccinated at the moment. So that's all good news. The news from Europe is not that good yet, because even if Indonesia would open, then we still have to wait for other countries to open their borders as well. But at least there is some movement going on there. Yeah.
Exactly. All right. So I guess it's time to let Crissy get her well-deserved sleep.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again.
Sleep well, Crissy, and thank you so much.
Good night.
We will see everyone next time. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.